My name is John Goodman, and today we are talking about a very important concept in contract law called the power of acceptance. The power of acceptance. And the way this comes to light in the Colorado Real Estate Commission approved contract is the offer form, the contract form, has a date in it, a deadline date in it. It is something called the acceptance deadline. Now, some people are under the impression that the acceptance deadline is the date by which the offeree, the receiving party, generally the seller, generally remember the buyer writes the offer, it's the date by which the seller, the listing broker, must respond to the offering party, the buyer. No, that's not the case at all. The seller hasn't agreed to any contract, so the seller is certainly not obligated to respond by the acceptance deadline. So what's the point of having an acceptance deadline? Well, the point is that when a buyer makes an offer on a property, they're saying we are giving the power to the seller to accept this offer at any point until the expiration of the acceptance deadline. The acceptance deadline identifies the last point in time through which the receiving party of the offer, generally the seller, has the power to accept that offer. Now, can the receiving party, the party who receives the offer, can the offeree do anything to eliminate that power of acceptance that the seller would otherwise have? And the answer is yes. If the seller rejects it or counters that offer from the buyer, that terminates the power of acceptance. And that notion is counterintuitive to some people, and it creates some mischief. So let's talk about two scenarios where that creates mischief. One is, while I'm recording this in a hot market environment, lots of buyers, low inventory, I'm going to start with a simpler example. And the simpler example is the example that's the slow market example. In the slow market example, let's say a buyer makes an offer on a property for $480,000. And the seller knows that it's worth $500,000, and so the seller counters at $500,000. Now, that offer that buyer submitted, let's say they submitted that offer on a Monday, and it had an acceptance deadline of Wednesday. The seller counters the offer on Tuesday at $500,000. The buyer is not interested in the property anymore. The buyer has remorse and decides to pursue other properties. Can the seller on Wednesday turn around and accept that original offer that the buyer submitted at $480,000? And the answer to that question is pretty decisively no. The seller cannot, because the seller's counterproposal destroyed the power of acceptance that the buyer granted the seller in the buyer's initial offer. All right, the more complicated example is the hot market example. In the hot market example, the buyer submits the offer. The seller wants to counter at a higher price. Let's say the buyer submits the offer at $480,000. The seller counters at $500,000. The buyer wants to try and meet in the middle, and the buyer counters the counter at $490,000. Let's say, again, that the counteroffer from the seller has an acceptance deadline of Wednesday. The buyer submits their counter to the counter on Tuesday. The seller decides to go with another buyer. Can this buyer that we're talking about, the first buyer, make a decision to accept that counterproposal that had an acceptance deadline open until Wednesday? No. The counterproposal from the buyer to the seller's counterproposal terminates the power of acceptance in that original counterproposal, and the buyer is out of luck. Ladies and gentlemen, there's an article that we will link in our description of this video to you that explains all of this perhaps a titch more succinctly. And remember, be careful out there. We live in a complex world.